can we give a welcome to Mr. Anthony Bone, please.
Thank you very much. I don't mind being praised, but when it's wrong, I don't speak fluent modern Greek. I manage. Never mind. Let me introduce this evening by introducing our two speakers. Our topic is, can Greece recover? And they're both going to speak to you for about 20 minutes or so. And then we shall proceed to part two, questions from you to them. And I'll say more about that when we get there. On my right, Mr. Nikos Dendias, who trained as a lawyer, but is now a member of the Greek Parliament, in the Voulis, and he sits there in the name of the party of Nea Dimokratia, Nea Dimokratia. On my left, Mr. Stathis, Dr. probably Stathis Welakis, who is a reader in political theory in King's College London and has studied in Paris too. Politically, he was, I'm told, a member of Syriza, but feels that Syriza has drifted away from the position he thinks they ought to be in. So he's detached himself. We have two probably rather different points of view. I'm going to ask Mr. Dendias to speak to us first.
Thank you. I have to say, for me it's a great honor to be here tonight and argue on this subject. Well, is a Greek recovery possible? We've been fighting around this question for the last more than 5 years, the last 7 years. And I will argue for the point that the Greek recovery is feasible. But in order to achieve that, we need a new economic and model of growth. A new model completely. Let me tell you this. Now let's imagine that tomorrow morning, Minister Schäuble wakes up in a very good mood. He feels that he should do something for his partners in the Eurozone, the Greeks, and calls Angela Merkel and tells us, let's donate this 320 billion that the Greeks own to the Union. And they both agree. The German chamber votes for it, and suddenly Greece is free. We owe nothing to the Union, and we put under the same category also the European Monetary Fund, etc., etc. Would then Greece be all right? Would the Greeks' problem have been solved? My answer, unfortunately, is a no. Worse than that. In 10 or in 15 years, Greece would be in exactly the same position as it is today. Give or take a few million euros, a few billion. So, what are the causes of the crisis? Let us divide, internal and external. If we walk on the street, in Panepistimiou Street in Athens, and we pick ordinary people and ask them, what is the cause of our problem? Why are we in this mess nowadays? I think something like 30 or 40% will answer, it's the memorandum. And a few more will say probably something is the European Union, or it's capitalism, or it's globalization, or something like that. I think that's what you're going to get as an answer. The truth is that it is the structure of our economy. The model that Greece is following, at least after 1974, after the fall of the junta, and up to 2009, or April 2010, when the crisis became apparent. Essentially, since the beginning of the 80s, the then socialist government of the time implemented an economic policy that was based on raising the income of the average Greek household, but that became possible through extensive borrowing from the markets and from the European Union. So we have a growth, but that growth was created from consumption, and also we did not balance that with an increased productivity. This led to a series of macroeconomic imbalances. It widened the public deficit, and since that not even during the high growth rate of the 2000, there was a lack of fiscal consolidation measures, and no structural reforms took place at that time, although the prudent thing would have been to do so during the years of growth, we came to the point that we all know in 2010. Of course, at that time, the deficit was huge. The markets were not willing to lend us any money. And then, as we know, we had to ask for our friends and partners, the Union, to come and rescue us. Now, so we have an economy that was sick. Was the treatment right? Were the memoranda the right response to the illness of the Greek economy? That is a more difficult point to argue, because it is clear that although many things included in the memoranda was absolutely right, and we should have implemented them ourselves even before the crisis, also there were quite many mistakes in the part of the plan that we implemented in order to get Greece out of the crisis. First of all, the debt crisis revealed the lack of political and economic union in Europe. It was very clear that Europe was not prepared to effectively manage such a crisis. The Eurozone governments were struggling to overcome their legal skepticism concerning the legality of the bailout, and failed to give a clear signal indicating their readiness to support one of their partners. Also, the European Central Bank did not have a clear strategy to fight the imminent debt crisis. And that is the reason that the Union decided to bring the IMF aboard, the European Monetary Fund. There are many other things that one could say. The role of the credit rating agencies, which also panicked, but I don't think that is an important issue which should take our time. We have 3 bailouts by 3 different governments under the same conditions: deep budget cuts, steep tax increases, and reforms which would help Greece to become an easier place to do business. As I said before, in principle, many of the reforms were necessary, but also the conditions were harsh. I'm going to divide the period in 3 stages: 2010-2012, 2012-2014, and 2015 up to today. The first bailout, 2010-2012. During implementation, it became clear that the predictions of this plan was very optimistic. What I think now with the hindsight becomes apparent is that our creditors and the Greek government of the time failed to foresee the implications of the severe austerity measures to the economy. And they were quite slow to understand the inherent structural weaknesses of the Greek economy. To cut a long story short, what the Papandreou government did at the time is impose horizontal cuts to the wages in Greece, whether at the other time being very good in imposing the structural reforms necessary. The first package was the 110 billion package, and at the end of it, our debt went up to 146% of our GDP, 16 more than when we started with the crisis. The second bailout, 2012-2014, started with a good omen, because back in 2011, we had a deep haircut in the Greek debt. 53.5% of the 188 billion debt, which was expressed in bonds, was cut. That program, which was implemented by the coalition government of Nea Dimokratia and PASOK, the Samaras government, seemed to work. In the end of 2014, it was obvious to everybody involved that Greece had started getting off the track. I'm not saying that that was visible to the life of the citizen in the street, but if you look at the economic indicators at the time, unemployment curve has started going down. Also, we had returned from recession to growth in the economy, and the general climate for investment in the country has changed substantially. But again, as always, the government lost heart. The Samaras government lost the European elections by a small margin, something like 2%, but then lost its will to impose reforms, the structural reforms necessary. There was a reshuffle in June 2012, which were perceived by the markets as abandoning the reform goal. And as it's always the case, the Samaras government lost the elections of January 2015 by a huge margin, and Syriza became the government of the people. Now, the government of Syriza came in power determined to end austerity and abolish the implementation of the bailout programs. They negotiated, as you know, for 6 months. I consider this the worst negotiation ever, by far. They ended up with a 180 degrees U-turn, signing a third memorandum, and as we speak, trying to impose it upon a society that has voted for a government that would end all memoranda, and in a plebiscitum voted with a 62% majority against the memorandum. Not an easy job for a government. Well, now, what can we do? What needs to be done? 7 years in crisis, a government that has promised to do exactly the different from what it is doing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please look at the figures. Forget about governments, forget about memoranda, forget about everything, about the crisis. Greece exports, if you don't take into account tourism, 1/3 of what it imports. And also, another figure that would sound rather peculiar here in Cambridge, innovation in Greece is 0.83% of the GDP. There is no economy in the world that can stand on those things. We have and we need to change the whole world completely. Can it be done? Of course it can. And it is not as difficult as it sounds. What do we need? First of all, political stability. When I say political stability, I don't mean a one-party government or something like that. When I say political stability, what I'm saying is that we should look at the same reality. We should all look at the same picture. Second, a stable tax system. We cannot change our tax system every 4 or 5 months. We have to reform the public administration. We have to reorganize the structures. We have to rationalize the processes. We have to make the best use of human resources. And we have to create a modern performance assessment system. We have to accelerate the efficiency of judicial procedures, and we have to proceed to an ideological restoration of entrepreneurship. And also, last but not least at all, we have to impose a drastic reform in our education system. If the education system creates the impression to the young Greeks that the market forces and the forces of globalization are the source of all evil, then, of course, you can understand that to promote entrepreneurship is something quite impossible. Our model of economic growth. On this one, I will speak on exact points, because I have been tired to hear the same things time and time again. A new model, okay, fine. What do we mean by a new model? How should we proceed? First of all, new enterprises. We need 100,000 at least new enterprises in Greece. So we have to support a framework for innovation, and we have to access facilitation to entrepreneurship. Apart from the new enterprises, we have to look on the existing enterprises that have survived or are fighting to survive the crisis. There's a distinction. Those that are servicing their loans and those who cannot service their loans. I would start with the second, those that cannot service their loans to the banking. On that, we have to decide which are viable and which are not viable. Those who are viable, we have to help them survive, taking any measure necessary. Those that are not viable, which in Greece and in the world economy are called the zombies, we must close down as soon as possible. They suck blood from the economy, and that blood is very much needed. We have to change completely our insolvency law. The insolvency law we have dates back to a different kind of economy, to a product economy, not to a services economy. We have to create a scheme for facilitation of exports, and we have to use real estate as a growth rate. Many of you know that the coastline of Greece is equal to the coastline of Africa. This is an enormous hidden value behind Greek real estate, which now is not materialized at all. On the contrary, the tax policies push the values down every day and send foreign investors away.
Your tax policies.
When we are speaking about framework for support of innovation, we mean that we should integrate research in the framework of development. We should introduce technology transfer offices in every university. I know that here in Cambridge that is like stating the obvious, not the case in Greece. We have to create also a connection of the scientific research to enterprises aiming at transferring technology and attracting investments in Greece. We have to encourage young people towards entrepreneurship and give to every citizen of this country who has an innovative idea for the establishment of business but lacks the necessary funds, the opportunity to obtain the financing that will let him materialize. We have funds available. The National Strategic Reference Framework has 20 billion. And the Juncker Plan adds 15 more billion to that. That is 35 billion euros. By the way, from those 35 billion euros as we speak, the current Greek government has not used even one penny. Now, is there an example in the world that we could copy? Because some of you may be right to think that it's quite naive for an ex-minister like myself to come here and argue that we can change this country like that. Well, can you look back to Israel in the 60s? Many of you are young, you don't remember it, a few are older. Back in the 60s, Israel was a socialist kibbutz economy. Nothing more than that. The Israelis fought their 1967 war with French arms. They were producing practically nothing. I have spent 5 months as Minister of Development. During that period, I asked the Israelis a lot of questions, trying to figure out how they did it. I came up with an organization in Israel called YOSM. The person behind that YOSM organization is an old man, 77, 78, called Yigal Erlich. Yigal Erlich was the person that created all this scheme that allows young people to create startups, being able to find seed capital, create a friendly environment, create the legislation for venture capitals, for business angels, creating incubators around the country, and after 30 years, changing a primitive kibbutz economy to a technological superpower. This is an example that we can copy. And we have created the blueprint on that, although it remains now unused in the Ministry of Development.
Can you bring your remarks to an end? Can we finish?
May I have 2 more minutes, please? Thank you. Apart from innovation, we should easily create a red carpet environment for export. The existing environment is a red tape environment. And also, we should use, I repeat, real estate as a growth. You can't imagine how many people around the world would love to own a small piece of land in Greece. I am finishing by repeating myself. It is difficult to be optimistic in Greece today. But I'm arguing that is feasible, and if we have the political will, we can change the country in a rather acceptable period of time. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, and many thanks for offering me the opportunity to participate in this debate. So many thanks to the Hellenic Society and the Cypriot Society for organizing this event. Can Greece recover any country can recover. Greece is not cursed, although it seems to be cursed. The image we have now, the picture we have of Greece, is of course a picture of an unmitigated disaster. There are two images, I think, that can sum up this disaster. The one is really an image in the strong sense of the term, because we see that in the media constantly. It's the image of the thousands and thousands of refugees that are trapped in the country in totally unacceptable conditions. They are reaching, I think, 40,000 now. About 13,000 are trapped just in the front between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And as you know, the European Union has validated this totally scandalous situation by de facto accepting the sealing of the borders of the country and the completely inhumane treatment of all these refugees. I'll say a few more things about this eventually. But the second picture, which now is less visible in the media, is of course the picture of a country that is sinking under the shock therapy that has been imposed to it uninterruptedly, and indeed by all governments now since 5 years. That shock therapy has destroyed the country and very seriously undermined any perspective for its future development. Moreover, this shock therapy has provoked a political crisis that actually has been deepening with, and to a very large extent, to a decisive extent after Syriza's U-turn this summer, about which I will tell more in a moment. But let me start with a preliminary point. When we talk about Greece, many times it is presented as if Greece was a kind of anomaly in Europe, as if the Greek disease was something particular. In the picture of the situation that has been given by Mr. Dentius just a moment ago, he emphasized the kind of narrative which was exactly the narrative used when Greece entered the so-called bailouts and the period of the memorandum. And the narrative was, the profligacy of the Greek state, the corruption that exists in Greece, all the pathologies of Greece after 1974, and so on. But hold on a moment. Just months after the Greek bailout came the bailout of Portugal and of Ireland. And although Spain didn't have a formal bailout, there was a kind of informal situation because of the fate of the Spanish banks. And I think that everyone here in the room remembers all the discourse about the so-called pigs, as they were called in Europe, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And the picture was pretty similar in all these countries. All these countries found themselves in a situation of over-indebtedness, although Greece was the most over-indebted of those countries. But once again, the level of the Greek debt at the time, in 2010, has now been reached and sometimes overtaken by many other European countries. For instance, the debt of Italy, the debt of Belgium is over 120% of their GDP and so on. So there must be something that is not specific to Greece, although Greece is part of that, and although it is more accentuated in Greece than elsewhere. And this is why I think that the lessons of the Greek situation tell us something not only about the country, but about Europe more generally and the world we live in. They certainly tell us something about the fact that Europe has completely failed, or when I say Europe, I mean, I don't mean Europe the area or Europe as a culture. I mean a specific political entity called the European Union. The European Union has completely failed to defend the values on which it is allegedly being found. I think that the decision that has been taken, which is the validation of the German Turkish plan, the main lines of which are to externalize to Turkey the management of the wave of the refugees, means that Europe turns its back to all these people who are fleeing situations of war, for which Europe and the Western powers bear a significant responsibility, and an entity of 500 million inhabitants, the biggest economic power of the world, says that it's not possible to let, let's say, 1 million people in, approximately the number that entered Europe last year. But of course, it's perfectly acceptable, apparently, to have nearly 3 million of those refugees in Turkey, country of which the per capita GDP is about half of the average European, and about 1 million in Lebanon. And suffice it to say that Europe receives only a small fraction, an insignificant fraction, of all the refugees at a world level. Now, there is another, I think, line that needs to be deconstructed concerning the way this crisis has been dealt with at the European level. And that line is that Chancellor Merkel, I mean, the Germans have really been wonderful in terms of public relations in this. She appears as being, generous and wanting to welcome refugees, but unfortunately, she had to give up and turn towards more restrictive policies because of internal problems, but essentially because the other Europeans and those, bad Eastern Europeans of the Visegrad group, with the backing of Austria, sealed the border. Well, yes, Germany indeed let about most of the refugees that entered last year Europe to come into its territory, because everyone knows that Germany needs labor force and skilled labor force, but also, equally importantly, that Germany, as the hegemon of Europe, also needs to make a moral point, which is by and large what the US had done during the Cold War period, appear as the welcoming country defending values of freedom and so on. But Germany, and here lies the hypocrisy, of course, of the whole situation, wants other European countries to do the dirty job. Germany always wanted, and not only Germany actually, all European states want to create buffer zones outside Europe, all around Europe, and Turkey is of course part of that buffer zone. The states on the other side of the Mediterranean were also used as buffer zones before the chaos that has been created partly due to Western and European intervention, see the case of Libya for instance. But the buffer zone is also internal, and we all know that the framework that was created by the Dublin agreements was exactly meant to make the southern periphery of Europe a kind of internal buffer, if you like, which acted as a natural filter, since any asylum seeker and any migrant actually automatically arrives on the southern borders in most cases, in the overwhelming majority of cases of Europe. So, this is exactly what has been happening since the start. The decision of the Eastern European countries and Austria to seal their borders and to cut the Western Balkan routes precipitated an event that is inherent, or a process rather, that is inherent to the very logic on which the European Union has been built. And this logic is, to put it in a single sentence, Fortress Europe. Fortress Europe is not something new, Let me give you one figure, the death toll in the Mediterranean. In 2015, about 3,700 people died in the Mediterranean. The figure was pretty comparable in 2014, 3,200. But in 2011, it was already over 2,000. And according to the NGOs that are working on the topic, between 1988 and 2010, about 19,000 people died in the Mediterranean trying to cross and reach Europe. This is exactly the scandal on which the whole logic of Fortress Europe has been built from the start. That is the negation of the very basic principles of human rights, agreements and so on which supposedly Europe is proud to defend and on which supposedly its soft power relies. According to me, a political entity that is able not only to tolerate, but to plan methodically via the militarization of its border and via everything we see now happening in front of us, such a political entity absolutely deserves to perish. Let me now come to the second cross that Greece is holding as a country since now 6 or 7 years. And that cross has a name, and Nikos Dergias was admitted that, he was honest enough to admit that for most people indeed, that cross has a name, and that name is memorandum. Let me remind you a few pictures. We are talking about a country that has lost more than a quarter of its GDP in all that period. In a recent study made by an economist of the Greek Central Bank, Sofia Lazaretou, the comparison between what she calls the Great Recession, which is Greece, of the last 6 years, and the Great Depression of the 1930s, works in a way in favor of the 1930s. Because, as she says, the Greek disaster has been swifter, has been deeper, and has been greater in its extent. In order to assess the situation, I want to read you, and you will forgive me the relative length of that quotation. It was given in a talk less than 3 weeks ago in Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government. I quote, "In Greece, 2 successive programs of austerity and of orthodox reforms have failed. It is very likely that the 3rd memorandum will fail. Its objectives can and should be met, but Greece will remain a country stuck in stagnation and poverty. It has to be offered an opportunity to start anew, or it will be inevitably driven out of the Eurozone with unpredictable consequences for Greece and for Europe. And this is not just an economic issue, but it is a threat that is looming in the current state of the EU. The state of the EU can be described as follows. I select a few points here. The ECB doesn't work as a traditional central bank, and its policies cannot stimulate growth. The experience of the last 8 years has proved that the monetary union doesn't serve the interest of all. Very few steps have been taken to address the European democratic deficit. The austerity policy imposed by Germany is now refuted by the IMF itself." And he continues with the following, I quote, "The crisis has made Germany the strong pole within the European Union. Indeed, all paths in Europe now point towards Berlin and Frankfurt. However, the German recipe of monolithic austerity doesn't address the macroeconomic issue and creates social unrest and political instability. It divides Europe, delegitimizes its political system, fuels Euroscepticism and political extremism." And further on in this talk, the speaker said the following: "The refugee wave found Europe unprepared. The old European devils of nationalism, and let's not be afraid of the term, of racism, woke up again. The European idea is drowning in the Aegean Sea and in the Italian shores. Greece becomes the scapegoat of Europe. If the wave of refugees is not dealt with as a European problem, it will be the end of the European Union as we know it up to now." This speaker is Mr. Daskalopoulos, the president of the Confederation of the Greek Industrialists. Not exactly a leftist, as you can see. And he points to the fact that not only the recipe has been worse, that has been followed, has been much worse than the disease, but of course that the problem is much deeper, and this problem of course includes the Greek and the European dimension. Of course the Greek economy and the Greek state were fragile even before 2009 and even before the creation of the monetary union. Their fragility is very largely due to the fact that the economic model has been based to at least some of the elements which are now proposed as an alternative by Mr. Dendias, more particularly the real estate, or more particularly kind of plethoric growth of the tourism, which is not bad in itself, but which has become somehow the only industry this country seems to be able to offer. The dream that Mr. Dendias has offered for us is, if I understand him correctly, a mixture of the Spanish coastline, which is a very great place. It's sufficient to see a few pictures. Development in a country that looks like Tunisia, with a political regime that looks increasingly like that of the Kosovo protectorate. This is, of course, because the fact that not only Greece, but also Spain, but also Ireland, but also Portugal had found themselves in that situation, in a way is very simple. All these countries found themselves over-indebted, either in public debt or in private debt. In Spain it was the banks. The Spanish budget was in a situation of surplus. Is because they were losing competitiveness. And anyone knows, this is absolutely basic, that in a monetary union, if you have a gap in inflation and therefore in labor costs between the countries, and supposedly the European Union was designed in order to prevent that from happening and to have a convergence on supposedly an inflation rate, which never happened actually, then the countries with low inflation rates, in this case the countries of the European core, first and foremost Germany, will get very quickly an increased comparative advantage. They will become big export machines, whereas the countries with higher inflation rates and growing labor costs, although the labor costs are much lower than those of the German labor force and those of the German workers, will lose in terms of competitiveness. They will create huge deficits in their current accounts, and those deficits in the current accounts can be met only with one way, debt. And indeed, this is exactly what happened, with a different balance between the countries depending on the force and strengths and weaknesses of their state. The Greek state is indeed notoriously fragile, but everyone knows why it has been notoriously fragile. It has been fragile because the tax system, the tax burden in Greece, has traditionally been supported only by the wage earners and by the modest and middle class incomes, whereas Greek capital and higher incomes and upper middle classes have never been properly taxed. Indirect taxation, which is socially unjust, is higher than the European average.
Please, can you bring your remarks towards an end?
Yes. The implementation of the shock therapy destroyed Greece's economy, produced immense social suffering and damage, but it also destroyed the Greek political system. The traditional parties have collapsed or have seen their strength very greatly reduced. They are now a shadow of themselves. They are perceived as failed and discredited forces. Syriza came as a power, as an alternative, as a power able to offer a new perspective, with indeed those promises of breaking with austerity and achieving a relief of the Greek debt. But there was a contradiction internally in the promise of Syriza. And I think that Wolfgang Schäuble is absolutely right when he says that this cannot happen within the framework of the European Union as it is. And we have seen, indeed, that the very modest, actually, demands of the Syriza program, a kind of very mild neo-Keynesianism on which most economists agree, on which even Daskalopoulos implicitly agrees, and I think this is the meaning of his statement, was sufficient to wage an all-out war against that government from all the European powers. The responsibility, of course, of Syriza is that it capitulated in the most undignified and pathetic way, and now, with the complicity, of course, of all the other parties, of nearly all the other parties represented in Parliament, starting, of course, with Nea Dimokratia and all the forces which have implemented the previous memoranda, is now indeed implementing exactly the opposite of what it had promised just a year ago to do. Therefore, it adds and it deepens the ongoing political crisis, which will know spectacular developments in the near future. To conclude, for me, the main problem that Greece has to face now is that its political system has completely failed to provide any kind of sustainable alternative. And this is why the situation is blocked and will become even more blocked in the future. But it would be an illusion to think that this is the end of the story. We have entered a period of great social and political instability, not only in Greece, but in the rest of Europe. Who would expect that a small party of the radical left like Syriza, until a few years ago, would become a kind of major political force on a promise which it has been unable to realize, but which shows how breakthroughs and great upheavals in the political system are perfectly possible when societies are mobilized, when people resist the fate they have been imposed, and open up new futures. And I think that we have seen similar political developments in many other European countries, but not only. Even in this country, who could predict that someone like Jeremy Corbyn would be elected as the leader of the Labour Party? Who would expect that in the US, someone claiming openly to be a socialist can be considered as a serious challenger in the Democratic Party? So the story is not over. We are not at the end of our surprises. And the Greek people, you know, they have a very long history of resistance and struggle. Those who think that it's over will lose their illusions very quickly in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening so carefully to those two analyses. I'm now going to invite questions as follows. First, please wait for a microphone to be brought to you, and please introduce yourself. There are 2 microphone carriers. Second, please don't make a great speech. Consider the question you want to ask and ask it as clearly as you can. When I've got one, I will look around to see if anybody's waving saying, I've got a question somewhat similar, or in that area. I'd like to string together 2, 3, 4 questions, and then invite our 2 speakers to respond to them. So, have we got a first question? There's a lady down the end there. To Ben. Ah, it's a gentleman, right.
My name is George Fisher. I'd like to take up the issue of change that was brought up by Mr. Dendias. He mentioned change in education and in enterprise. Now in this country, I come from the field of education, and in this country it would be trying management of change for quite some time. And unfortunately, change comes very, very slow. Sometimes doesn't come through until the next generation. He also mentioned the issue of Israel. Now, yes, that is true. On the other hand, Israel has had a massive input of funds and support, a huge input from the United States. Now, the question is, how will Greece manage to get investment from abroad for further change and further development? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Sorry. I would like to add on that question because this is a very important issue, the issue of change. Mr. Fisher said about funds. I think we have more than enough funds in Greece. We have been given more than enough funds from the European Union compared to Israel, in the order of around 5 times more per year. So the issue is not the funding that is lacking. And to go back to what they said before, is that they all said that the bailouts failed, and the IMF confirmed that of this failure. Yes, they failed because of the multipliers. Greece has no multiplier on investment. You invest and you get less than you invest. And this is a structural problem of the Greek state itself. And we hear the term the problems of the Greek economy, but we never hear of the problems of the Greek state and of the structure of the state itself, and how people can check and balance politicians, judges. Now, I would like them to tell me what are they planning to do about the problems of the state, because as a Greek, I have been confronted with these problems many, many times. I've tried many, many times to invest in the country, and I've found walls in front of me. Walls from Polydormia, everybody knows the word, I believe, and walls from the tax office. So I would like them to tell me specific about the state, not the economy. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Angelo. I want to refine on your point, which I think is very important. When you talk about developing the country and making that productive and getting technology incubators and real property state, etc., the point he says is very important. What are the vested interests that you have to overcome? Who are the losers that are resisting changes because it's not convenient for them, whether it's politically or economically or otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kourelakis, would you like to respond first? I will try and do it.
Right. Let me say the following. I don't know about the multiplier of investment in Greece. What I do know is that in 2007, the investment in Greece was about 25% of the GDP, and it's now less than 10. Right? What I also do know is that in a destroyed country, no one is willing to invest. Except what is happening now in Greece under the name of investment is actually Greece selling out for nothing what is left of its public assets. And apparently this is something that Mr. Dendias is in favor of. The coastline, or pieces of the coastline, are sold for nothing. One of the biggest scandals is, of course, the selling of Elliniko airport. It's the biggest piece of land of that type in Europe, in the front, the seafront of Athens, the old airport, and it will be sold for peanuts, literally, instead of becoming a park. And this is the case of all the rest of the so-called privatizations, which have been happening in Greece. And this will bring absolutely nothing to the country. This is just stripping the country of its public assets, and they are given for nothing to private investors who will just benefit from a rent of situation, because there is absolutely no risk, of course, in investing, and profitability is guaranteed if you buy Greek ports for nothing, if you buy water companies for nothing, public investments and public infrastructure, because this is the only things that are being left. Greece needs, according to Sofia Lazaretou, and I think this is a reasonable estimate, about 100 billion in the forthcoming, I think she says 6 or 7 years of investment to find a path of growth and to repair some of that damage. It's a complete illusion to think that this will come from European funds. There is nothing concrete in the Yukon plan, and the sum that you have quoted is for how many years? Those 50 billion, and we don't know actually what is, except from really already existing funds. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. Greece will never find a kind of growth without the state and public investment playing a very important role. And Greece will never find the path of growth without breaking both the vicious circle of austerity and over-indebtedness. The reason why the memoranda failed is in a way very simple. They have completely destroyed internal demand by destroying wages and labor costs, supposedly to increase the competitiveness of the country, and they have completely destroyed public spending. And the recession was absolutely inevitable. And there has been a real multiplier this time, the multiplier of recession. So the vicious circle works as follows: over-indebtedness, budgetary surpluses to repay the debt, cuts, plus all the rest. Those cuts are never enough, actually, and those surpluses are unattainable. Therefore, new memoranda. Now we know that the third memorandum will fail. A new package will be necessary. More loans to Greece, and therefore more that need to be repaid. So I think that, in a way, the economic debate has been settled. There is absolutely no future for Greece inside the Eurozone. And there is absolutely no future for Greece if there is no drastic relief of the Greek debt, which is impossible to achieve. We have seen that without unilateral moves, which means defaulting on the debt.
Well, first of all, I think I should answer the questions. On the funding questions here, I looked on it myself, because I was under the impression, as you are, that Israel was able to fund its expansion and growth through funds coming from the United States. The truth is far from it. The money that they got from the United States were mainly used on the war machine, not the growth of the economy. And also, the Israelis, my second research was the Israelis abroad, the diaspora. And I thought, are these the guys that funded the growth of Israel? Again, the truth is no, they were not the ones. And there is a saying in Israel: how do you achieve a small fortune? The answer is, you start from the United States with a big fortune and you invest it in Israel. The American Israelis lost their money in Israel. It was not foreign money. And we don't need huge amounts. And we have more than plenty in our hands. And to cut a long story short, even apart from the 20 billion, which I heard from Mr. Kouvelakis that it's not a huge amount, and the other 15 billion of the Juncker plan, which again was not a huge amount, also our European partners are willing to help. We have established, we managed in those 5 months to establish in Luxembourg a small dedicated vehicle called IFG, Institute for Growth, which has now 183 million, something like that, exactly money the Greek state could pinpoint to startups that are hopeful. But yet again, this government has not used one penny for it. And of course, sir, I'm sorry, but you didn't say your name, so I cannot answer you. Eh?
Mr. Kontakos. Kontakos.
Mr. Kontakos, I agree completely with you in what you say. The Greek state is the obstacle. It is the obstacle. I don't have the time to expand here on a full restructuring of the state sector that is absolutely needed. But the revolution has to take place on that. You're absolutely right. Then it kills every investment from the small one of somebody who wishes to open a shop or something like that. You need 8 signatures, 8 different signatures to open a cafeteria in Athens. That is crazy. It cannot go on like that. Mr. Kouvelakis is a very eloquent speaker, and his English are better than mine. Although I have studied here and mostly in Greece now, so it's not easy to express myself how I used to be. But this argument, I hear it again and again and again. I know it by heart now. I could really change, sit there, and apart from the Daskalopoulos speech, tell you every last quote that Mr. Kouvelakis was kind enough. And it's exactly what Syriza was saying 7 months ago. Exactly the same thing. There is somewhere another world. We just have to break loose of this damn world, and there, that other world, everybody will be happy and rich. No euros, no Merkel, no Schäuble, no European Union, no migrants, nothing. Growth will come immediately. And that will be the socialist paradise. We don't have to produce anything, we will find it. We'll become cost efficient. Suddenly, magically, without reforms, without pain. Of course, Greece now is a failure. Everybody admits it. But I'm arguing it's not a memorandum. And we see now Germany as the hegemon of Europe. If you remember, there was The Economist a few weeks had the German eagle on its front page and Madame Merkel and said, the reluctant hegemon. Now I'm 55, 56, and I have a good memory. Back in 2000, please look in the web. Again, there was The Economist with a yellow crotch page and the German eagle. And the underlying title was The Sick Man of Europe. But then Chancellor Schroeder proceeded with the reforms needed in the German economy. And the German state, from the sick state of Europe, became the hegemon of Europe. I'm not envisioning Greece as being the hegemon of anybody. But there are reforms that need to be made, and they need to be made now, not tomorrow, not in 100 years' time. They need to be made now. And of course, we have to develop in Greece. Spain, Mr. Kouvelakis was right, is not a perfect example. But that does not mean that we cannot create environmentally friendly investment in Greece. Ellinikon is a scandal. Yes. Why didn't other people appear to buy this property in that scandalous price? By the way, that does even not materialize as we speak, because the situation is such that nobody would invest a penny in it. And if we create a park, how do we create growth by parks, by the way? And who is going to pay for that big park? Do you know how much the parks cost in the United Kingdom? I'm reading that you're going to privatize all parks in the United Kingdom. And so we are creating state parks in Greece. We are the rich ones that would support more parks. We need a growth strategy. I'm ready to discuss. I don't say that what I'm saying is necessarily right. But we have an action plan with figures, with date, with measures, with cost, and with hope in the end. I'm ready to discuss with anyone who has a similar plan what can be done for Greece.
Thank you.
But that is as far as I can go. The end of this speech.
Hello, my name is Alex. I came in the UK a year ago to work as a doctor. I would like to ask Mr. Kouvelakis, in his speech he didn't mention anything about our mistakes, Greeks' mistakes, the mistakes of Greece's economy. And it's alright to put the blame on others, to put the blame on the European Union, on Germany, but if we don't look at our own mistakes, we won't be able to improve, we won't be able to survive this crisis. And I can accept that the European Union is not an exceptionally well working machine, but Greece is definitely a faulty cogwheel. And you didn't mention anything about our problems. So, is this your policy? Is this your way of thinking? That we should always put the blame on others? Because if that's the case, that's why the UK people will vote in favor of Brexit. Because they've had enough of sustaining a spoiled child like Greece. Thank you.
Thank you. Beside you.
Another question for Dr. Kouvelakis. Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Former Syriza, I'm a student of political economy here in London, actually. My question is, you mentioned, Dr. Kouvelakis, you mentioned the current account deficit as a problem. And then you went on to say that a solution to the problems that the Greek economy faces right now is to boost internal consumption. But the current account deficit reflects an economy that is import-oriented, and that we need to address that problem by boosting the export, doing the exact opposite, not boost the internal consumption, because that will lead us to where we were a few years ago with a huge debt and a huge deficit and a very high current account deficit as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I hope the previous questioner who's come here to work as a doctor is finding the experience fruitful under the present government, which shares most of the same ideological presuppositions as Mr. Dendis' party. I hope you were with your colleagues on the picket line this morning. My question concerns the political crisis that Stathis spoke about with regard to that leftward polarization. Yes, we see Bernie Sanders and we see Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, but the flip side of that coin, whenever capitalism goes into crisis, is the rise of the far right. In Greece, it takes the form of Golden Dawn, but we see it in Scandinavia, we see it in France, we see a slightly more kind of homebrewed version of it here in the UK with UKIP. But the consequences of the rise of a political formation like Golden Dawn in Greece, I don't need to tell anyone about that here. But what we do know is that there is footage of members of Nea Dimokratia who were in some sort of secret brokering deals with Golden Dawn to try and kind of come to some arrangement with them. So the cooperation of the kind of right wing of capital with fascism is not far to seek. So I'd like both speakers to address the question of when a political system goes into meltdown as a result of a serious economic crisis, the prospects of ideological polarization, we see a leftward drift, we see a rightward drift. And it's the task of all of those of us who abhor the politics of Golden Dawn to come together and fight against that. So I'd like both speakers to address the current situation with regard to the rise of a deeply abhorrent political formation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Dendias to respond to that first. Fairly briefly, if you can, so we can get more questions.
It is going to... well, as you know, sir, I'm sorry I didn't catch your first sentence.
Oh, of course. My first sentence was addressed to the previous question who's working here as a medical doctor.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Now, as far as the Golden Dawn is concerned, well, most of you, I'm not sure that you do know, but I was public minister, I was, let's say, the Interior Minister for 2012-2014. And and I was the one that initiated a judicial procedure against the government, which ended in the current trial. I don't know what will happen at the end of the day, but you're right to address Golden Dawn as a potential source of problem. I think is a very small word to use in this case. I don't have an answer. Unless the political system can perform, we are in trouble. We're in trouble for the far right, from the far right, and we're in trouble from the far left. And I can't even dream what would happen if Marine Le Pen wins the elections in France in 2017. And what would that mean for Europe? But if we have to provide an answer, that means create success out of the process of moderation. And in the end of the day, create growth in the economy. If the political system fails the people, then they turn to awkward solutions.
Right. The Greek mistakes of the economy. Well, Greece had a weak productive basis, of course, before, but that weak productive basis was completely destroyed or enormously weakened as a consequence of the monetary union. Because Mr. Dendi has used the example of the reforms of Schroeder with the deregulation of the labour market more particularly. And indeed, it is true, in a way, that this disciplinary way of keeping the labour cost in Germany completely flat, and therefore the inflation completely flat, is at the core of the German competitiveness. But you know what? Not everyone can imitate Germany. Not only because it would be a joke, to compare the productive basis of Greece to the productive basis of Germany, or even of smaller countries of Northern Europe. But essentially, if someone makes surpluses, someone has to be in deficit. The enormous surpluses of Germany, something about 7%, I think, of its GDP, above the authorized target of the European Union, mean that other countries are indebted. The southern periphery has been the most exposed to that, but not only. France has been one of the big losers of that competition. So when Vaskalopoulou says that we have seen that the European Union is not working equally for everyone, he's absolutely right. The very structure of the European Union produces winners and losers. And instead of producing convergence, and this is the way it was sold to the European people, that it would produce convergence in prosperity, not the race to the bottom for part of the continent and the others being on the top at the expense of the rest. So this system, unfortunately, cannot be reformed because it has been institutionally built in a way to escape any form of democratic control, as we can see from the Frankfurt Central Bank. Demand has been slashed, and there is absolutely no recovery without boosting demand. Demand doesn't come only from consumption. By the way, investment is also part of demand. And demand is not only, consumption is not only from salaries, it is also from credit. The European Union created huge current account deficits in some countries and made credit very cheap. So the drug addict also found a very cheap price for its drug. This also has to end, and unfortunately I can't see any coordinated way of changing the Eurozone, and therefore I think that unilateral measures such as exiting concerning Greece are inevitable. One last thing about the far right. Of course, everyone knows, it's an open secret, that the Party of New Democracy was divided on that issue, and that there were very important circles within the party. The most well-known figure is, of course, Mr. Baltakos, who was a key councillor of the former leader, Mr. Samaras, who openly tried to build bridges with Golden Dawn. But what is extremely worrying for me is the fact that the ideological and discursive ground for the growth of Golden Dawn has been prepared by mainstream politicians. who have been ruthlessly cultivating xenophobia and racism in the recent period in Greece. And I have to say that in that respect, Mr. Vendias, as the Minister for Interior, as he said, or for Public Order, has given a very bad example by launching absolutely brutal operations such as the oddly called Xenius Zevs in 2002, which was a vast anti-immigrant pogrom in the very center of Athens, in which tens of thousands of immigrants were humiliated and brutalized and searched in completely undignified positions. Greece has been, at the time, denounced by human rights organizations such as the Human Rights Watch, but also by the representative of the European Council on human rights for this. Mr. Vendias had at that time compared the problem of migrants of Greece to the invasion of Greece by the Dorians 4,000 years ago. I think that this is exactly the type of discourse, and Mr. Vendias, of course I cannot but mention this because he's present, but he's certainly not the only one to do that. If we start competing with the far right in that terrain, we will lose our honor, but we will lose also the political game, because as Jean-Marie Le Pen, the French leader of the far right, very rightly says, people always, at the end, prefer the original to the copy.
Mike Romanos. I want to start by saying that my view is that both sides have a point. Greece has certainly had big problems, and I'm personally aware of the challenges in doing anything and the corruption in Greece, but at the same time I think Greece has been destroyed by the euro. Now, Greece isn't going to get out of the euro immediately, it's stuck with what it has. Can we not at least get the different sides in Greece agreeing that for the time being we can improve the state and work together without letting all the time these barriers in opinion, and I think there's right on both sides, without all the time letting these barriers of opinion get in the way of working together to massively upregulate, improve the state, its bureaucracy, the laws, etc., which desperately need to happen, whichever path Greece takes.
Thank you. Question.
Hi, my name is Sotiris. I study medicine. So I feel that both of the speakers sort of concentrate on very different parts of the argument, but none of them has said like if there is anything that Europe can do as a whole to solve the problem. So basically that's what I want to ask. I mean, for example, during the memorandum, like the amount of tax that Greeks owe to the state and they can't pay increased by like from 30 billion to 80 billion. So obviously, just by reforming Greece on its own all the time, if people can't pay, it can't fix the problem. But also, I don't know how leaving, maybe the problem is with the Eurozone and we can fix the Eurozone instead of leaving it. So I would like to both of them to tell us what they think about what we can do at the European problem, at the European level to solve the problem.
Thank you. The man in white.
Hello, my name is Andreas. I'm from Cyprus, and I would like to tell both speakers that I'm very sad to see this good debate being done in basically football terms, like Olympiacos versus Panathinaikos, whereas we both go to Europe and we don't score any goals. And the point is that the question is, can Greece recover? Greece cannot recover because it was never healthy. And my question is, what do you think that needs not to be done, but what do you think that the target should be? Because it's very nice to say we want growth, but don't say what your target is. It's very nice to say we want a combined Europe with prosperity, and don't say how you imagine Greece to prosper. So, and the last point that I would like to make is that this whole debate makes me really sad, because in Cyprus, we didn't even have a government majority in the parliament, and all the memorandum bills were passed without anyone being outside of the parliament. And whereas in Greece, you see the most common sense bills going to the parliament, and both parties, if they are in power or not, they try to make people resist, as if handing to power is the most important thing on earth, even in a country that you don't really have anything to gain from. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go on taking some questions, because then we'll probably be getting towards the end, and each of our two speakers will have to collect as best they can what's been asked. There was a question down here somewhere. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. Thank you both speakers. My name is Barry Colfer. I'm from Pembroke College, but also from Ireland. Ireland and Greece both endured bailouts for very different reasons, but one thing that ties them together is the fact that there was this crazy idea where two small parts of Europe, representing a tiny percentage of its GDP, was shackled with enormous proportions of its banking and private debt. Secondly, the consequences of the refugee crisis that was referred to, this absolute shameful situation that we're all aware of, is actually related, or the consequence of something similar to this idea, the lack of the mutualisation of the Greek and Irish and other debts. This is the fact that we have economic and monetary union, but we do not have a political union at the European level. It might be an inconvenient truth, but two of the voices shouting most clearly for sense around the refugee crisis are Presidents Juncker and Schulz of the European Parliament and Commission. Rather than willing the European Union to perish, it is not obvious that the clearest solution to these two enormous crises in Greece, Ireland, Cyprus, Portugal, Romania, elsewhere, and also the refugee crisis, is not merely the need to strengthen and to improve the European Union, rather than talk about either leaving it or abandoning it altogether. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Yukia Bakhti. I'm reading Politics and Trinity. What I see from everyone talking is an excessive focus on long-term, short-term solutions, on scandals rather than the crisis as a whole, on Elliniko rather than what the Eurozone has been going through for the last 15 years. And in the grander scheme of things, 15 years is not much. It's not long at all. And as Mr. Vengas pointed out, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it might have seemed as if Germany was the winner of the loser of economic integration, and Greece was the winner. And I just want to ask if, as you said, competition hasn't really worked within the European Union, it's been, or the rule of competitive advantage. What I want to ask is rather whether we have to focus on a long-term solution, such as stronger integration or eventually a federal European Union that will limit those differences, those structural differences within the Eurozone, rather than saying that we have to abandon the project altogether, or that we have to focus on the other being Germany.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Yannis Mastoris. I'm a PhD student here, and my question is for both of you. I would like to think back from the 80s till today. And my question is on the relation between populism and the tendency of the voters to approve it. How does this affect you as a politicians that have to take strong measures which are not pleasant and the majority does not understand how important they are for the country and for them, especially knowing that elections are around the corner? What is the impact of this what is the impact on this continuous crisis? Thank you.
There's a question behind there somewhere.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Kontakis again.
Sir, you've had one.
Yes, I did.
That's enough. Well, there are people who still want another. I'm sorry.
Good evening. My name is Apostolos. and the question that I have for the speakers, mainly towards Speaker 1, Mr. Dendias, is that I would really like to press on the political reform question. In Greece, we're not having really an economic problem. I mean, we are, but that comes from a massive political and state issue. Regardless of what we say, the narrative has been exactly what you used in your 20 minutes of speech. We're going to change things, we've learned from our mistakes, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I do not care if you change taxes, I do not care if you encourage investment, because none of that will ever happen if you do not change politicians, the political system, or anything like that in Greece. If that doesn't change, and we need you to tell us how you're going to change that. You told us you're going to attract investment. I'd rather you discuss how you're going to change the politicians and their minds and the whole little shop of horrors that they've set up in Greece.
Thank you. I'll take one more. The microphone is coming.
Hello. During the debate, I've had some common threads regarding my criticism of how to stipulate. My name's Kevin. I'm doing engineering, and the argument I've heard is that Greece needs growth, and the European Union is sort of an obvious, easy target, as in they create these bureaucratic layers, or they imbalance the continent, they favor some countries. But then there's a sort of an easy position to take to blame this big organization that no one has any responsibility for. And especially in this country, where you can say, it takes 30 years to build a runway at Heathrow here. And this is not the way, it is not a fault of the European Union or anyone else. It's a country itself needs to, it's their own policy to build their growth and focus on innovation and so on. So, especially also the refugees. You can blame the European Union for failing at the refugee crisis, whereas on the other hand, the UK as a country has done absolutely nothing, has done it even harder to let immigrants into their own country. So I don't think the European Union is the right organization to blame for the whole economic development. But if the speakers could have any words for us regarding their position on the vote, especially Brexit, leaving the European Union, just because of the two polarizing opinions, that would be good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the two speakers now to have about 5 minutes each to gather together what they want to say and what's been said. Dr. Kourlakis, please will you start?
I'll focus on the questions. Can we imagine European solutions? On paper, yes, many of them. Mutualization of debt is, for instance, one. The European budget being spent for pro-growth policies. All this perfectly works on paper, but it doesn't work in reality. Why? Because, for instance, for the mutualization of debt, someone has to pay. There is a cost, which means Germany, and Germany will not pay, right? Except it is forced to pay. And therefore, measures such as defaulting